Welcome everybody. This is the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition webinar on COP28. You're all very welcome. I'm Oisin Coughlin from Friends of the Earth, and I'm facilitating on behalf of Stop Climate Chaos. And it's very nice to be back in a Stop Climate Chaos webinar. We did a lot of them over the last few years, but not so much recently. So obviously you all know that COP28 is on in Dubai at the moment, and there's been a fair bit of coverage over the last week of the issues on the table, from loss and damage to fossil fuels to is there science around needing to get off fossil fuels, and the exchange between the COP president and Mary Robinson. So there's plenty to discuss, and we have a great panel with us to talk about it. Some of whom are at the COP, some of whom are going to the COP, and some of whom are in touch with colleagues who are there. So I'll introduce them as we go along. This is a very simple format. There's going to be 5 minutes or so from each panelist, and then plenty of time for questions and answers from the floor, so to speak, using the Q&A function that's there at the bottom of your screens, hopefully, as well as being able to see us on the panel. You should be able to see Q&A. So if you can put your questions in there, we will get through as many as possible when we get to the Q&A part. If there are others, we'll try to answer them as we go along. But that's the main functionality for the Q&A. I see someone's already got one in there. We'll have a look at those as we go along. Okay, so we're going to start with my colleague Jerry McEvely, who is the head of policy change in Friends of the Earth, and who is, after he finishes this webinar, jumping in a taxi. I don't know, getting there, Jerry, to go to the airport to go to the COP for the second week. But obviously he's been following it very closely from here, and we'll start with you, Jerry. Over to you.
That's great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jerry. As Oisin said, I'm the head of policy in Friends of the Earth Ireland. I am coming over to COP, but I have been following it from here. Many people have made fun of me about flying over. Unfortunately, this is the reality of COPs, and also the reality that it would take a long time if I was to cycle from Ireland to Dubai. But what I'm just going to do now is maybe give you a little bit of an overview of what the COP is and what it isn't, a little bit of information on the context, and then some information on the whole fossil fuel agenda. You would have seen a lot of this in the media. And I have structured my 7 minutes around where, what, and what next, or maybe how and what next. We'll see how we get on. And some of you will be very familiar with this, but I'm just going to start with maybe a little bit of an explanation about COP, which is linked to where. So I'll begin. What is the COP? You would have heard before, or you might have heard before, that it's Conference of the Parties. So in other words, it is the coming together of state parties, of states, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so under the UN's main climate change treaty, and that treaty also provided for the Paris Agreement in 2015. And these COPs, which happen every year, are the main negotiating opportunity among governments. And what actually goes on there, basically officials and ministers from all around the world negotiate specific commitments, all related to climate action. Some of them have very specific work streams, and there's god-awful acronyms, but all related to mitigation or adaptation, so reducing emissions or adapting to the climate crisis, and also around financing. And long story short, this is important because it can lead to really significant overall global commitments or significant individual commitments by states. And the upshot is that where these commitments are made, and this is why Friends of the Earth and everyone else here is interested in it, where these commitments are made, whether it's individually or globally, they then lead to real policy making and investment and opportunities, and ultimately requirements for government to take real action. I'm going to get on to where now. The real eagle eye amongst you may have seen that it's in the United Arab Emirates, it's in Dubai, which is a major, fossil fuel producer. And this is, of course, a major issue, a conflict of interest. You may have also seen that exchange between the chair and Mary Robinson was, it was as ridiculous as it was unacceptable, with him denying that, the need for a fossil fuel phase out, which is entirely incorrect and inappropriate. And like many people would ask, how is the COP happening in a fossil fuel producing country? The basic answer to that is it all just simply comes down to this being another UN process. So the COPs move from country to country, but they move from region to region, and countries push for the honor and glory of hosting the COP. And it's an opportunity, obviously, for governments to in some way strategically put forward their own interests. In terms of chairing the COP, it's obviously not the case that an individual country can make individual decisions. It's all about agreement in the room, so to speak. But we have seen this before. Poland has led on COPs, and their fossil fuel record is quite poor. And we've also really seen, major problems with greenwashing and fossil fuel interests dominating some agendas before. And this is, unfortunately, we would say, is simply a continuation of that process, of that problem. I saw a report yesterday that this COP is in fact even worse, with almost 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. And again, like, how can that happen? The real answer to that is there needs to be much better regulation and transparency around who is allowed to attend and who is allowed to essentially be given access to the COP venue. And of course, the challenge here is that this all requires consensus among states, many of whom are themselves petrostates. That's all the background. What's actually happening? The other panelists are going to take up some of these issues in more detail, so don't worry if I gloss over a bit. But maybe the most important context for you to know is that there has been a stock take, is the jargon, but a stock take of countries' pledges, climate pledges so far. And simplifying, they are not enough. They're nowhere near enough to keep us on track with Paris, with the 1.5 degree threshold. And as a result of this official global stock take of pledges, governments have to respond. And this is the real focus of this year's COP. So all eyes are on what that response is, not in sort of a vague general sense, but what specific commitments, in order to prevent this gap in state pledges, what specific commitments will be made at COP in response to this stock take, to prevent, ultimately to prevent the ongoing climate breakdown that we're seeing. And we already know, as I said, that the stock take will indicate the governments have fallen well short of Paris. And we also already know that at the moment, this is context now, but we're headed for a disastrous temperature rise of 3 degrees. And the IPCC and UN and others are all clear that any further extraction and expansion of fossil fuels is simply incompatible with that 1.5 degree limit. I've done the what of the context, the what, and this is the main focus, I guess, of my presentation. The what in terms of what we need to see happen in terms of fossil fuels is really clear language coming in the COP's main political outcome, its main political decision that will hopefully be negotiated and agreed by the end of the COP next week, is clear text on fossil fuel phase out that will keep us in line with 1.5. You may well say, of course that's what's needed. How have they not agreed this before? That's completely ridiculous. It's the elephant in the room. How have fossil fuels not been addressed specifically in the text? And we would say, we agree with you. We want you to say that too. So, to go into a bit more detail, fossil fuels are not specifically addressed in the Paris Agreement. That, I'm not going to address the history of the Paris Agreement, thank God, but actually what the Paris Agreement more so provides for is a framework for governments to collectively enhance their climate action plans, to simplify and to come back every few years to ensure there is an increase of ambition. That's the general idea of Paris, but it doesn't say anything about fossil fuels. And to make the link back to the stop take, which I talked to you a bit previously about, we already know from negotiating positions of different blocks, it's generally these things are negotiated, whether it's the EU bloc or blocks from other continents, that there is strong support for language around a tripling of renewables or a doubling of energy efficiency. However, not enough in and of itself. In other words, while this technological revolution, a renewables revolution, is absolutely needed, and it's particularly needed in developing countries, it's not enough if we're still adding fuel to the fire. So this again goes back to the need for clear language on fossil fuel phase out.
Gary, I have to stop you there.
Am I up to my 7 minutes? Am I?
You are. Past.
What I'll just say to simply finish off is that you may have seen some discussion around this use of abated or abatement, which essentially refers to potentially removing emissions in the future through carbon capture and storage technology. That's really problematic. That could result in so many loopholes. So we're not pushing for that. And lastly, as well as pushing Ireland to really support progressive fossil fuel phase out language, we're also calling on Ireland to support the development of a new fossil fuel phase out treaty, which is something that could complement the Paris Agreement and really ensure that states globally take hard action to prevent further fossil fuel production. Okay, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jerry. Just to remind everybody that they can put their questions into the Q&A function, and I'm delighted to say, because it wasn't working the last time we had a webinar, there's a thumbs up facility in that. So if you go and look at the questions, if you have a question of your own, great, stick it in. You can also go and look at the questions other people have put in, and you can give a thumbs up to the ones that you most want to hear answered. So when we're stuck for time at the end, we will focus on the questions that have most thumbs up. Now, many of you will have heard from Jerry before, but you hopefully, or not hopefully, but you are less likely to have heard from our next panelist, whose name is Charles Eris Akalali. I didn't check your pronunciation properly, Charles, beforehand. And Charles works for Concern Worldwide in Kenya, and he's from Kenya himself. And he's a senior officer in livelihoods as part of the Concern team. And he's seen the impacts of climate catastrophe in his own community and wider society. And that's what motivated him to get active in climate issues, particularly around agriculture and food security. And he initiated and led the Turkana Hunger Relief Fund drive, supporting almost 300 food secure households within a local municipality there. So he's spoken at various international forums regarding the issues around access to water and disaster relief, and he hopes to continuing work on climate, including in master's studies. So we're really happy, and Charles is at the COP in Dubai. So we're very happy to have Charles with us to talk about how he sees the issues at the COP from his perspective and given his experience.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be a panelist in this discussion. It is a very important discussion for people affected by disasters, and even for other people to champion on how these people can be supported or protected from disasters. And here I will talk about four things. I'll talk about Turkana and how climate change or disasters have affected the people living in Turkana. Then I'll also talk about what is happening here in COP. And then thirdly, I will talk about the fossil fuels and what is my observation. And lastly, I'll talk on loss and damage fund for those communities that are affected by disasters. For those who don't know Turkana, I live in Kenya, and I'm from Turkana, which is the northern part of Kenya. It's one of the 47 counties, and majorly a pastoralist county, where people depend on livestock. nearly 99% of households there depend on livestock. So Turkana is inhabited by 1.2 million people, according to the recent census. And disasters affected these communities for a very long time. And this has been worsening from 1980s to date. And last year was the peak of drought, where 146,000 households were affected and lost much of their livelihoods. And also almost over 400,000 livestock were wiped away by the drought. And this is something that necessitates some of us, specifically me, to talk about issues of disaster and how we can mitigate or make people adapt or become resilient on this. So we missed rainfall for 5 consecutive rain seasons, and the peak was last year in December, and that's why I really came up with that fund, Turkana Hunger Relief Fund, just to support communities, because most of them could not access food. And you see, the gum rates have really gone high, and for a very long time, nearly 6 years, we've been under emergency. And currently, the gum rate stands at 24.6%, which is high above the 15% threshold. This is, of course, alarming if you cannot talk about it and see what are some of the measures we can do to elevate that. And here in COP, I thank Concern for facilitating me to be here. And there are very many things happening here in COP. There are a lot of events. We can see countries having discussions on how best they can adapt or become resilient, or what is affecting types of some of the climate impacts in their country. So we can see many discussions happening. We can see indigenous people here in COP. We also see institutions, universities, and other institutions coming to champion or to talk about climate, because this is something of the heart. It is not something that we learn from the university, or it is something of the soul and heart. It is because it affects our people, and we talk because it is with us. We are the victim. So it's like everyone is coming here to ensure that the world becomes safer for everyone. And we see people, we see activists. There are very, very many events happening. So you tend to choose which one to attend depending on where you come from and what actually will this impact to your life or to the lives of people you live with, or the lives of people in the globe. So there are very many events happening here, and we have managed to attend some of them, because nearly all of them are very relevant, but because of time and all this, you tend to say, oh, let me attend this. So very, very interesting. But when I talk on fossil fuel, we understand that the reasons why the rains are not happening even in Turkana County is because the climate has been affected. And mostly this is from the fossil fuels. And we understand that 116 nations have committed to transit to clean energy. But again, there is no that clear roadmap on how these countries are going to transit and the time it takes, because we currently understand that per day we emit nearly 40 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it means that even achieving the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, it becomes a challenge. And if the vision was Vision 2030 on how to ensure that by that time we transit to have clean energy. But we see that this is not going to happen, because as Jerry talked, there are many fossil fuels lobbying group here, lobbyers around COP, and you see they have direct access to where the decisions are made. And indigenous people, most of us who are from humanitarian organizations, just observers, and we are just outside here. And we cannot really be with to lobby on where the decisions are made. So it tells you that moving from fossil fuels to clean energy will take time, because if you have people, 2,500 people who are lobbyists for fossil fuels, having direct access to where decisions are made, and these other people outside here, it means that there is more strength on that. And if you see the commitments people are making to ensure that those affected are protected, it tells you that probably the nations will not move from the fossil fuels. It will mean that probably they will start working on the loss and damage fund. given money and then assuming that you are protected, but at the same time the fossil fuels production is going on. So I see an area where such crops should be protected from such group. Because you see, I give an example. I come from a conflict prone region, and most of the times you talk about peace. When you have peace discussions, you cannot have at the same time people manufacturing arms be there to promote arms manufacturing. So it doesn't really work away. So it is something that I see is not coming very soon. It might take time, and by the time these are really gone further, many of our communities who are at disaster prone areas will really have a lot of risk. So we need communities protected from such climate risks, and we need commitment. We need genuine commitment, which personally I don't see. Although, because even having such discussions happening here, United Arab Emirates, a large producing, country of fossil fuel, tells you that probably it is right to have negotiations here, so that it gives people the importance of having fossil fuels, because people can see a very developed country, and all these countries have developed because of fossil fuels. So it is a discussion that we need to be genuine, and even those discussing issues of fossil fuel at the decision table must have indigenous people, must have communities affected at the decision, not at the peripheries as observers. So it is something we need to maybe take on a different way. And on loss and damage, which is my last topic to talk about, we understand that this fund was agreed on last year in Egypt, and it is a fund for those affected. And by the fact that this fund has already been taken to be hosted by World Bank, it tells you, we understand how World Bank works. This will be loans, and you cannot from a disaster. And these countries are already struggling with debts and a lot of economic issues. So having the fund in the World Bank already tells us that even accessing this fund will be a problem. And another thing is that we have seen commitment on loss and damage fund coming very slowly, which means that those countries that are great emitters, are not even really committed, because you see countries by that December, 3 days ago, we've seen 700 million being committed, and we even see most of them are not committing. So it is a fact whether it's really coming to support communities or not. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Charles. And I'm sorry I have to be ruthless about time, well, pretty ruthless, because I do want to get to some questions. There are interesting questions coming in, and people are using the upvoting facility. So just to put the panelists on notice, there are questions that we'll be coming to on the role of fossil fuel lobbyists, and on the role of the issue of economic growth, which is an interesting one. And there's one on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty that has a few votes too. So just to put panelists on notice to keep an eye on the Q&A. And speaking of panelists, the next panelist is Paul Chukwuma, who is a Nigerian climate change researcher and represents the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, where he is the communications coordinator. And the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition is a coalition of around 900 young people from more than 70 countries, from the north and south, globally speaking, who have come together to demand action on addressing loss and damage caused by climate change that you've heard Charles already refer to. So Paul, we'd love to hear from you about your perspective on what's going on at the COP and what needs to happen next, if you can see us and hear us.
Yes, absolutely. Can you confirm if you can hear me loud and clear?
We can hear you loud and clear, yes, thanks.
All right, perfect. I can't turn on my video because of the bandwidth here, but so yes, thanks a lot for this opportunity to be here. As he mentioned, I'm with the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, now 1,000 youths from 70 different countries, and yes, I think the previous speaker already highlighted crucial points on the loss and damage. On the progress of what he says is synchronizes significantly with with my perspective as well on the progress made. So yes, on the loss and damage fund, we've made there was like a huge win on the first day, which of course, reflecting or on what that means to communities still leaves us with lots of questions and lots of work to still do. Of course, what we actually called for wasn't just a fund; it was a fund that is additional, that's adequate, that is predictable. So what we have right now are just pledges from countries, and I mean very far away from what it should look like. Looking at the pledge from the United States, it just shows you that we aren't yet talking serious business. And I think it's important to reference the speech by Simon during the open plenary, when he said we've been taking baby steps and it's time to take bold action. I think um, the operationalization of the fund we currently have now is just a baby step to what we actually call bold climate action in regards to the loss and damage conversation. So we have the fund, but then there are still lots of questions. What does the predictability looks like? There are lots of there are lots of trigger points that would enable exits from the World Bank. 6 months from COP, 8 months from COP, and 4 years, assuming the 8 months trigger isn't put in place. So as a youth following the negotiation, also within the coalition, these are the kind of questions we're asking as well. At what point do we begin to talk about predictability for the fund? How about adequacy? The floor value should be 100 billion, and we currently have 720. I think it's important to also highlight that not all of that money is going to the fund. Some is for the funding arrangement. Some of the pledges made also is going to the Santiago Network on loss and damage. But I guess the overall contribution to the fund will be better understood after COP, I guess. So that's what it looks like. Also, yesterday we saw the operationalization of the of the Santiago Network on loss and damage, which is also a significant win as well to the conversation. Because while we're talking about actions to address loss and damage, it's also important to look at how we can catalyze technical assistance for countries that are suffering from the impacts of the climate crisis. So operationalization of the Santiago network finally has happened, after ironing out the final details of the whole secretariat for the Santiago network on loss and damage. And we're kind of hopeful to see what that looks like moving forward, and how best countries can assess this technical assistance to address the losses and damages that are facing at grassroots level. So some significant progresses, so much questions still left to be answered on the loss and damage fund. That's my general reflection on the progress made so far at COP in regards to loss and damage.
Thanks, Paul, much. And I'm sure Siobhan, who's coming next, may have more to add on loss and damage. And if there are questions, please do put them in, because Paul, you have saved us time. You've been very succinct altogether. So you definitely have credit in the bank if you want to come back in on some of these things. People may be interested in knowing that, like, Minister Eamon Ryan, the Irish Environment Minister, was very involved in the negotiations last year on getting a deal to have a loss and damage fund over the line, and Ireland was on the transitional committee during the year that that drafted the text that was adopted at the beginning of this COP. But obviously, as I'm sure Sean may tell us now, we as NGOs and civil society still have a lot of issues, and as Paul has highlighted, there's a lot still to figure out and to make this actually make a difference on the ground. But and again, people should feel free to put the questions into the Q&A and vote for them. As we get towards the end, we may try and answer some of the other questions that we won't get to live. We might try and answer them by text, as in by typing, but we won't do that yet, because otherwise if you do that, you can't vote on them. They disappear to a different column. Anyway, our next speaker is Siobhan Curran, who is head of advocacy and policy with Trócaire. And as most of you know, Trócaire is the Irish International Development Agency of the Catholic Church, and they work with local partners around the world in the world's most at-risk communities, and they work with people to tackle the underlying causes of global poverty and injustice. Trócaire is a founding member of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, and indeed Siobhan is the current chairperson of the Stop Climate Chaos Steering Committee. And this year, Trócaire, together with Christian Aid, another member of Stop Climate Chaos and another overseas aid agency of other churches, published a report called "The Cost of Inaction: Ireland's Fair Share of Loss and Damage Finance." Over to you, Siobhan.
Thanks so much, Oisin. Hello, everybody. I found a spot here at COP that seems to be quiet enough, but then a concert just suddenly started up behind me, so they've stopped now. So I hope they don't start again, because it might look like I'm having fun at COP when actually I'm working very hard. So yeah, maybe just to say, I suppose, a reminder of why Trócaire would be at COP. Climate justice is a key campaign for us, and it is because the climate crisis is such an unequal crisis, and it's impacting women and girls in particular ways. It impacts Indigenous people in particular ways, and really exacerbates inequalities. And we've seen it in our work in Trócaire, for example, in Somalia. Last year, as many as 43,000 people lost their lives due to drought. And of course, this year, people are facing massive flooding. Actually, an area the size of 21% of Ireland has been affected. So the impacts are really hitting people in the global south disproportionately. And that is why, for example, loss and damage is such a massive campaign for Trócaire, and it's so important because there's this whole host of losses and damages, from loss of lives, from loss of homes, culture, way of life, that are affecting people. And we know in the richer parts of the world, we have failed to reduce emissions quickly enough. And we also know that corporations are making massive profits while they have stopped action on fossil fuels. And to add my voice to the shock at seeing the numbers of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP, and I actually think there is a sense of kind of real shock being the word here. And I think people who have attended many COPs aren't shocked by a lot, but really the number is massive. We worked out it was 30 times the size of the Irish party delegation. And one just has to wonder why bad faith actors are being let into negotiations which should be rooted in human rights and climate action. And I suppose just to say, yeah, the other backdrop to COP is we saw the recent UN report that showed that we're on course for 3%. We also came into COP with massive under-delivery of climate finance by the global north to the global south. So there is an agreement already that money should flow from richer countries to countries deeply impacted by the climate crisis. And year after year, it's not delivered. So we came into the COP with trust at an all-time low. And we also know that while richer countries have promised billions to in this climate finance, the actual estimation is in the trillions. So I suppose I won't repeat the analysis that both Charles and Paul have provided on the loss and damage fund. We fully concur with as well. And I mean, I think there's the agreement is really, really positive to get. But there are, I suppose there have been concessions made in the final text of the agreement, and there was a feeling from civil society and developing countries that if the fund was filled, if you could fill it at scale, if you could get commitments by richer countries at a scale and a level that's needed, that this could address some of the concessions that were made in the text. And yet we see this 700 million commitment across pledges, across states. So it is so far off what's needed. The descriptions I heard of this were paltry, pathetic, peanuts. The US won the fossil of the day. I think it was on Monday. I'm losing track of days, but they gave just 17 million. So I mean, it really is. It's so disappointing. Ireland gave 25 million over 2 years, which was an interesting way of making their pledge, because no other country did that. They didn't say over 2 years, they just made a pledge. What was really disappointing about Ireland's pledge was that it came from an existing pot of money that was already promised to climate finance 2 years ago. So it's not additional. That is the key. I mean, activists and developing countries have repeated this point ad nauseum, that the money should be additional. If we rob Peter to pay Paul, we're going to get nowhere. And particularly in this case, because it came from money that was supposed to go to mitigation, reducing emissions, and adaptation, resilience. If you reduce those, the loss and damage costs escalate. So it makes no sense. So, I mean, we will be pushing for Ireland to step up and provide more money to the Loss and Damage Fund. As Oisín said, we launched a report that was estimating Ireland's fair share of loss and damage finance. And we'll be really pushing and hoping that you'll join us in making demands on the Irish government to meet their fair share. For this week, we'll be focusing on, as Jerry explained, the global stock take is happening. So what we really is an opportunity to get stronger language on loss and damage into the negotiations. That'll be in the stock take agreement and hopefully in the final text. And we'll be really looking to emphasize those points that Paul talked about: additionality, scale. We need a commitment for money at scale in the agreement. So that's something we'll be really identifying with Minister Ryan as head of delegation as something that's really important. So maybe just to kind of finish up, I suppose, I think another few things that struck me, I went to a talk where the Special Rapporteur David Boyd was speaking, and he was really saying he felt human rights had become, like, they weren't present enough in the COP, and that there's not enough human rights analysis and the links with the climate crisis. So I think that's really important for us to all think about. We know this is going to be a fossil fuel COP in some ways. Next week, at the end of the week, we'll all be looking to see a fast, fair, feminist funded phase out of fossil fuels. And I think we have to remember as well that also needs finance. And for developing countries to phase out, the finance also needs to be delivered. So they're fundamentally linked. Loss and damage funding needs to move from millions to billions, and climate finance has to move from billions to trillions. So we've lots of work to do. And then the final thing that I think has been raised in lots of civil society meetings is the need for much more representation in decision-making spaces by women, by Indigenous peoples, by youth groups. And I think there's a lot more work to do on that as well. So.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. That was I got at least one tagline out of your last few sentences there around the fast, fair, feminist funded phase out. So our last panelist before we get to the questions. So while Mary is speaking, you have your last chance to put a question in the Q&A or to vote on them. And actually, you can. We weren't sure what I've ordered them in my view according to how many votes they have, if that's helpful to see them. But I think I've only done that for myself. You each have to do it for yourselves to get a sense of which questions are most likely to be answered when we go around the panel one more time before the end. But first of all, our final panelist is Dr. Mary Keogh, who is the advocacy lead for CBM Disability Inclusion Global. So she's based in Ireland, but she works for a global federation of organizations working alongside people with disabilities living in the world's poorest places to fight poverty and exclusion and to transform lives and build inclusive communities. And climate justice is one of the issues they work on, along with access to health and community services and humanitarian access as well. So Mary, a bit like what Siobhan did, you might be interesting to start by saying why the COP is of interest to CBM and what your particular perspective is before you bring us through your main issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Oisín. And I just realized I'm the only panelist with the PowerPoint presentation, and I never do PowerPoint presentations usually, so apologies for it. So just also to say I'm here on behalf of CBM Ireland also, who is a member of Stop Climate Chaos, but Mabub, who's actually over in COP at the moment. So I suppose just to set the context of why we're involved with COP, and we're actually quite new to the whole kind of climate justice and COP agenda. And it's very much building on what Siobhan and Charles and our colleague from Nigeria have spoken about in terms of the impact that the climate change is having on the countries that we work in. We're looking at it at the nexus of humanitarian disaster risk reduction, and also in terms of how it's reversing development gains. And the group that we work with and the groups we work with are persons with disabilities who until now have been fairly sporadic engagement with COP itself, but also just in terms of the climate policy. So if you're looking at national adaptation plans and national determined contributions, there's very little mention around disability. There's absolutely very little disability language at a policy level. So there's a huge gap in terms of even thinking about disabled people as a group that are being impacted by climate change. So this is just a photo of our climate, the front page of our climate advocacy roadmap, which we launched last week at the start of COP. So maybe just next slide. So basically, I mean, where disability and climate meet is like where it meets for everybody else is I need to breathe. This becomes a huge issue for many persons with disabilities, particularly, and this example, actually, the photo here shows somebody who's using a ventilator in terms of getting access to energy to be able to use a life-saving ventilator, breathing ventilator. It also masks around how, you know, with the changing climate, with increasing pollution, that actually, you know, people are having to mask also in terms of that. So really kind of looking at that intersection of climate and disability, because very often we get asked, well, what actually is the intersection? So the next slide. So we launched our roadmap last week in the Philippines, which is very much at its core looking at how we engage with the whole climate policy over the coming years. Next slide. I'm going to take really quickly through this. And we're really looking at kind of a number of objectives. Next slide. We can make this, I can share this presentation after. So really this is kind of looking at four or five core areas of work. One is looking at the policy area. So looking at how do we get, and Siobhan there spoke about the human rights. So how do we get human rights language into the cover decisions coming out, into the various different texts that are being developed, and how do we also make sure that disability is included in that? Because we hear a lot from perspective of gender, we hear a lot from perspective of Indigenous and youth, but disability is just not appearing, despite the fact that disabled people make up a large proportion of the world. So working with partners in terms of how we look at kind of smart cities for climate is also another critical area for us. And then really, I think, you know, Charles really spoke to there, the crisis, the climate crisis impact at community level. This is really what's being felt by the communities that we work with. And how do we like really start to get these stories out there to be able to try and use them from an advocacy perspective for influencing change. And then the technical areas that we are involved in is a just transition and finance facilities for adaptation, loss and damage. And the previous colleagues have just spoken about that, so I won't go into any more detail. So next slide. So just where we're at COP. So at COP at the moment, there isn't a formalized constituency for disabled people at COP. So CBM Global isn't a disabled persons organization, but we work alongside and partner with disabled people's organizations. So this year, in terms of COP, we've looked at kind of a number of panel events. And I can honestly say, I mean, anybody who goes to COP, they know it's hard to get a side event and a panel event. And also it's a very crowded agenda. So it's only very slowly beginning to increase the visibility of disability. This year we contributed into that with the government in Nepal and their pavilion, talking about diversity and inclusion for enabling climate action, and really focusing around that with young people. We also have a advocacy messages, which I'll post in the chat, which is our key messages, which is done in partnership with the International Disability Alliance and the network of disability INGOs, who are now also beginning to engage at the climate frontier. So last slide, I think. Yeah, and this was one we had this morning, which was basically a side event held in COP to talk about the growing circles of dialogue on climate and disability, because that is really what we would like to do through our work and through our advocacy, is to grow those conversations, those intersections that are happening between the youth, gender, disability groups, and also happening between mainstream climate activists and disability climate activists. So that's it from my side. Hope that was short enough, Oisín.
Thanks, Mary. That was very, very much on the nose of 5 minutes. So thank you very much. So we do have about 15 minutes for questions, and there's lots of questions in the Q&A. I think I am going to basically have to go around one time again. That'll be about all we manage, and allow panelists to answer the questions that make most sense for them to answer from their own perspective. So that may not be the one that has the most votes, depending on what people's expertise or interest is. That means I'm going to start with you, Jerry. And as it happens, some of the questions that with the most upvotes are very, no, not all of them are somewhat linked to fossil fuels. There's one about the role of lobbyists and there's one about the whole COP model of having these meetings in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and is this the best way to do it, and what are the alternatives, and could it be done by a coalition of the willing, for example? So there's those two questions, and then there's one about the treaty. So but feel free to, in a very limited time, feel free to touch on those or any other ones.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll try and sort of address some of these questions individually, but I'd have a feeling that many of the other panelists who are at COP would have really good views on some of this as well. On the issue of lobbyists, I guess the question is, they don't play any official role, with emphasis on the word official, at the COP. However, the access that they have, the fact that many of them are actually part of country delegations, and the fact that they have an ability not only to to essentially have access to decision makers at the COP is a huge issue. So it's not so much that they play any direct role, but they have their access, and also the fact that they also do have an ability to, in certain ways, present at side events, present at essentially seminars, and they have that capacity to speak to the main decision makers at key moments is a huge problem. On the issue of, there was a question there around economic growth being the elephant in the room. You're absolutely right. And this is coming up more and more in discussions, I think, particularly, absolutely, in terms of Friends of the Earth, and that one of the need for system change is a core part of our demands. In terms of the COP, to answer your question, I do not think the questioning of economic growth forms part of the negotiations or is included in the text. And that's a fundamental weakness. And when I say the text, I mean ultimately what we might see at the end. However, like this questioning of ever-increasing consumption, this issue of economic growth posing fundamental problems for the temperature limits in Paris, and even issues around the notion of energy sufficiency, all of these are addressed in IPCC analysis. So the basis of it, the grounding of it, the rationale for it, and the real problems posed is present. And lastly, in the IPCC, on the issue of the treaty, how is it progressing? I would say that we've heard some positive, there's been some really positive developments. Colombia and Samoa have most recently endorsed the treaty. On the Irish side, we are, at the moment, we produced a joint statement for organizations to sign up to. There's also and show their support. There's also a sign-on function on the treaty website, fossil fuel treaty website itself. And from an Irish perspective, like we are, I would say, hopeful, because the rationale is really there for Ireland to support the treaty at a very high level. It's the basis strategically, politically, for support for the treaty is really there.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Charles, would you like to come in, and if you have any particular questions you want to address from the list? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. So on loss and damage, from this question from Irene, that is loss and damage fund an excuse for the fossil fuel to continue. So for me, I feel that at long run, this loss and damage fund can be an excuse for the producing countries to continue producing. And of course, it will look like we give you this money and we continue doing that because we are compensating. So it is something that we need to really look at very well to ensure that it doesn't go that way. And it is something that if allowed to continue, many countries that are producing much will give a lot of money on loss and damage. And of course, the poorer countries will say, okay, if you are compensating us, it's better. So I think that is where the tipping point is, and we need to probably, as those people lobbying for a clean energy or transition, can talk to the producers to reduce the production of fossil fuel. And on there's this other question that it seems, it seems that the whole COP approach, which is based on arriving at consensus, the UAE and these others, is already broken, because you see now there is no commitment. And having these countries, someone said yesterday that countries that are oil producers that are ventured on fossil fuels have already developed. And it is a question that you've already developed. Why do you think we need to stop this for us, and we want also to develop? So, and someone said that if the world goes out of fossil fuel, probably the economic growth will come down, and many countries will struggle, will be affected. So it is something that probably even the producing countries are seeing, and they might even, in long run, move out of COP because they feel that this is where their countries is developing. So I feel it is it is not a genuine conversation, and we need to see how it is moving.
Thanks, Charles. And I'm going to just keep on keeping on here. I may come back to either, I may do one last tiny round for someone, either maybe Jerry, Siobhan, or Aaron, for any of the sort of more very small questions there are down below about can events be followed online and so on. So before we finish off sort of those housekeeping questions. But now I'm going to come to you, Paul, for your answers to any of the questions that particularly struck you. I could see Paul a minute ago. I don't know whether his bandwidth has gone. In which case, I might come to you, Siobhan, in the meantime. Paul's
Yes.
here.
Oh, yeah,
Paul's
okay.
here. Hang on. Paul?
Yes, Osin, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can. Do you want to come in on any of the questions? I hope you've been able to see them in the list.
Yeah, I can see the questions.
Or any other observations you want to make based on the conversation you've heard, or any other key messages you want to get across to an Irish audience?
Okay, I think there's one I can see here. I don't know if this is the one you like me to respond to, but it still says, "Will the loss and damage fund be an excuse to stalemate on real fossil fuel phase out actions?" Well, I don't really think so, because basically, when there is more emissions, like Rajit was saying today during the actions here at COP28, more emissions simply means more loss and damage, because we have more losses, and we have the losses and damages because of the impact of the emissions, right? So I guess this also reflects in the global demand, which we put out as the Loss and Damages Coalition, which currently has over 25,000 signatures. One of the key demands on the 10 pillars that describes what concrete action to loss and damage looks like is actually a phase out of fossil fuel. It's a prerequisite, because if not, it's a vicious circle of emitting, causing loss and damages, and then having a fund to address the losses and damages. We aren't actually making progress on that. So a simultaneous synergistic cooperation between what we are doing regarding the loss and damage fund, and also what we are doing to phase out fossil fuel, is what creates a bigger picture of a possibility of a future where there's concrete climate action in scales and scope that matches what we are currently facing per unit time. I don't know if this makes sense, but my very specific response is it should not, and we do not expect it to be so. And just in case that begins to happen, we should understand the impact of not allowing that happen, as we're pushing for, because the Loss and Damages Coalition could have simply just said our key demand is a operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which is adequate, equitable, has a sense of predictability and the likes. But we put out a demand that also reflects the phase out of fossil fuel, the just transition, all these elements, one way or the other, enables us to have a systemic response to climate change, such that we do not have a vicious circle where we just keep acting contrary to what's needed. So that's like my simple response to that. I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. And finally now to you, Siobhan. There's a question actually specifically that mentions you about, did you say what Ireland's fair share of the loss and damage funding was? It's a question you might have, be able, as you're there, you might know something about, which is, are there lobbyists with the Irish delegation? And depending on how you define lobbyists, but because I guess you are one too. And if so, which industries? And then one as well, which you may or may not have an answer to, Jerry might either. How much are we bound by the EU position when it comes to negotiating on the fossil fuel phase out text, for example? And there may be other ones you want to come in on, but they just those ones I would be interested in getting a reaction to in the small amount of time we have left.
Yep. Perfect. So on our fair share, we've estimated that Ireland by 2030 should pay 1.5 billion per annum. And that's every year. And that's an estimate based on research on what the loss and damage needs will be. So that's a lot more than what Ireland is paying now. And it will need a significant scale up. But what we're calling for is public money, grant-based loss and damage funding, but also saying along with the existing funding from departments, Ireland should look at other sources. So for example, that could be a wealth tax, or it could be a tax on the profits of fossil fuel companies. So there are different ways of Ireland getting in money to pay for loss and damage. The lobbyists, you can go on to the UNFCCC website and look up all the delegations, and it so now shows you every single delegation, and so it shows the Irish one, the party which is the kind of the state, and then overflow, which includes lobbyists. So you can see a list in there. Yeah, and there was research going around from the Kick Polluters Out campaign, and they were showing they had one fossil fuel lobbyist listed. So you'll find it on the list there. In terms of Ireland's scope within the EU, so Ireland, will be part of an EU bloc. I suppose Jerry might come in on the exact kind of dynamics of Ireland on the fossil fuel phase out versus other countries. I can say in terms of other issues, Ireland has been able to play a more constructive role where it has a more constructive position. So I suppose the point being, there's always scope, and it's really, really important to lobby your TDs and the ministers who are there, because they can push and they can use their power. Although when it comes to it, then the EU position would be what Ireland comes under. I suppose, the last thing, just in terms of COPs, in case we all lose hope, there are a lot of problems with COP, with how it works, with the slowness, with sometimes endless discussions, and you just think, are we getting anywhere? But it's a really important multilateral space, and it's, everything is a fight, but that's the change we need to see. So we have to fight for everything, and there's text now on the global stock take, and there's language in it, an option that says phase out of fossil fuels, and that's the type of language that needs to be kept in. Of course, we know it's not easy, but it's possible. And I think the other spaces, like a fossil fuel non-proliferation would be crucial. There's also the human rights spaces where we can really push for, as David Boyd talked about, the states to be accountable for violations of human rights caused by the climate crisis. So there's many spaces, but COP is really important, and I think it's really important that we let Irish leaders know that we know they're at COP, and we're watching, and we're going to hold them accountable.
Okay, just before we finish, Jay, do you want to come in just on that question around Ireland's room for leadership, given the collective nature of the way the EU works?
Yeah, sure. So to be clear, that there is an EU negotiating position, and the lead in the bloc that Ireland is part of is a negotiator who represents all 27 member states. But Ireland can't contradict, I would say, the EU position, but it can go past it. And there's a responsibility on Ireland, I think, to both influence the other representatives from other member states to ensure the EU position is as progressive as possible. And naturally, Irish representatives are also talking to their counterparts from all other states. So there is that opportunity for influence. And it's also important to note, in terms of the EU position, that it is problematic in some ways, but it is progressive in the sense that it actually acknowledges the need for the energy sector to be predominantly free of fossil fuels well ahead of 2050, and the need for a decarbonised power system in the 2030s. And really, it's Ireland's, the responsibility is on Ireland to ensure that that type of language ultimately features in final text. That's really their role. And then to build on what Siobhan said there around this really being like the accountability, you need to hold Ireland account. On the one hand, I also agree that the COP can completely understand people's maybe perhaps cynicism or outright disillusionment. 2 points, final points on that. Number one, where there are real blockages, and it's clear that if it becomes clear that the type of progressive commitments simply aren't there, then there's all the more of an argument for Ireland to be supporting initiatives that live alongside the COP process. For example, supporting a fossil fuel phase-out treaty. There's also other pledges on the climate finance, on the adaptation side of things, also on reducing methane. There are other opportunities for states to come together, and you could argue that the main opportunity for progression outside of the COP is really where the EU comes into play, EU policy in Ireland to be a leader there. But my final point is that when it comes to the COP, and really this is worth, I think, reflecting on for future COPs, when it comes to accountability, like we need accountability moments at every COP, including but when Ireland and the EU is negotiating and agreeing its position. So really, it's not a time for disillusionment around COP. I think it's really hammered home the need for all of us to hold our decision makers accountable for what they go with to the COP, because ultimately the COP is simply a reflection of the positions, progressive or not, that member states have.
And thanks, Jane. And equally, accountability is not just for COP or Christmas, it's for all year round, as in a lot of this gets decided by national politics and by national campaigning. And the COP is just a reflection of that. And it is, a very particular setup because of the nature of independent sovereign nation states. Winston Churchill famously said about democracy that it was the worst form of government apart from all the others. And equally, we don't have a perfect system of world government. Antonio Guterres, who we happen to agree with lots, doesn't have the power to tell other countries what to do. So it depends on, each nation state being pushed by their citizens to the extent that they have the freedom to do so. And we're privileged that we have that freedom fully guaranteed in Ireland, pushing our representatives and our governments to do their fair share under the Paris Agreement. And the more countries, particularly the more rich countries, that show willing to do their fair share, the easier it'll be to build trust and build action and have a virtuous circle, because every degree counts and every ton and every tenth of a degree counts, therefore. So while the situation can appear bleak, there's always a choice of worse or better ahead. And the more focused we are, the more we hold our leaders to account, and the more campaigning we do, the better, or at least the less worse the future will be. Anyway, listen, I want to thank our panelists. We're a little bit over time, but thank you to the 100 people who are still online for coming to this Stop Climate Chaos webinar on the COP, and thank you to the diverse speakers we had from our organizations and beyond today. And good luck to those of you who are going to the COP or at the COP in the second week. We look forward to hearing your dispatches and hearing how it goes, and we'll obviously be encouraging people here to keep in touch and to keep active. And I know that There is on Saturday, Friends of the Earth is doing climate caroling at 4 o'clock on Grafton Street if anyone's around in Dublin. And there is a march being organised in Dublin by other organisations, I think at 12:30 in the Docklands, and going to the GPO at 1 o'clock around climate justice. We're not involved in organising it. Stop Climate Chaos are our members. Most of our members aren't, but it is happening for those who are interested. And of course, if you're signed up to the email lists of any of the organisations that are involved in Stop Climate Chaos, or indeed the Stop Climate Chaos email list, you'll be kept in touch with the various opportunities to get active and get involved around climate campaigning and climate justice. So listen, thank you all very much for coming, and best of luck.